Thank you. Thank you. Enjoyed that talk. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be speaking with fellow members of the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. Many thanks to Linda Cassidy for inviting me, to the staff of the University of Southern California for facilitating this event. The Mythological Centers of Lewis Carroll's Alice books was originally a chapter in my 2018 book, The Formal Center in Literature, Explorations from Poe to the Present. And this is the book, The Formal Center in Literature, Explorations from Poe to the Present. Other chapters in the book deal with a range of authors, from Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville to James Joyce and Zadie Smith. I'll briefly offer some background to the Lewis Carroll piece before I get to the argument. This is just a setup. And I'll be glad to take questions and comments with Byron after the talk. I'm a retired English professor from Penn State DuBois. I've long been interested in beginnings and endings of works of literature. Perhaps this began in high school when a teacher suggested that I read W. Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. I was very disappointed in the opening line, which is, "The day broke gray and dull." The day broke gray and dull. Especially for what was described on the dust jacket as the greatest novel of our time. With slight hope, I jumped to the last line, which closed, "and the sun was shining." And I thought, okay, this I can deal with. The language may be simple, but he had a sense of the whole. It was in graduate school when my interest in beginnings and endings developed into an interest in centers. I read Edgar Allan Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, a sea novel, and I was knocked out by the mysterious ending. I eventually wrote my dissertation on the book. I discovered that even as the beginning and ending were symmetrical, they framed a significant center. In the 13th of 25 chapters, in the 11th of 22 paragraphs, a week into a 2-week period, the character Augustus, representing Poe's brother Henry, died on August 1st, just as Henry had died on August 1st. There were encoded facing mirrors at the beginning and end of the novel that infinitely reflected the death at the center, suggesting infinite memory of the loss, what Poe later called, when writing of his Raven, mournful and never-ending remembrance. So I became interested in the centers of literary works. And here's where the Alice books came in. I should also add that I was a word and phrase reverser. When I was a kid, I was told that my name backwards is Dratcher Yelpock, and since that time, I've had a habit of turning words and sentences around. This is a good habit to be in to read Lewis Carroll. I'd like to clarify one term that I will use in my argument. Chiasmus. This word pertains both to beginnings and endings and to reversibility. It is the pattern A-B-B-A, as in, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's called chiasmus because of the Greek letter X, chi, formed by linking like terms. And you can see country linked to country and you linked to you, and we have the X. There is a variability to the meaning of chiasmus. It could be conservative, always returning to the beginning, A-B-B-A, or it could be radical, always challenging its first half in the second half, A-B, B-A. And there is a critical circularity to the trope. That is, we circle from A to B, continue with B, and circle back to A. There is a round and round quality in chiasmus, a quality that I think would make it very attractive to Lewis Carroll. Finally, there is the term hermeneutic circle. Hermeneutics is interpretation. The hermeneutic circle simply means that in interpreting a work of literature, we circle around from the detail to the whole, back to the detail, and back to the whole. The term is certainly applicable to my argument about Alice. And so here we go. The mythological centers of Lewis Carroll's Alice books. Alice says to her cat at the end of Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, "Tell me, Dinah, did you turn to Humpty Dumpty?" "I think you did. However, you'd better not mention it to your friends just yet, for I'm not sure." Martin Gardner asks at the end of his edition of the Alice books, the annotated Alice, why did Alice think Humpty was Dinah? He cites what he terms an ingenious theory, that even as Humpty Dumpty spoke to a king, a cat may look at a king. He also mentions an essay that observes that the name Dinah begins and ends with the initials of Humpty Dumpty reversed. Still, the question remains an open one. I will offer an answer applying a center-centered approach. I will provide a new reading of the Alice books, one complementary to other readings, including analyses of Carroll's life, such as Morton Cohen's biography and elsewhere, and considerations of Carroll's reading, such as Ronald Reichert's study and other works. I will curve around from the whole to a part to the whole, or from a part to the whole to a part, the hermeneutic circle. A circle, it will be seen, is a singularly appropriate image for reading the Alice books. And the hermeneutic circle will take us on another adventure in Wonderland, one that will lead to a new key. The Alice books are works of delicacy and whimsy, but they are also works of sturdy structure, of singular symmetry. We may consider first Alice's adventures in Wonderland, proceeding from the outside in. An overview of that classic reveals repeated framing. We see in the opening poem about Carroll's first telling the story, 4 stanzas into the 7, the 3 little sisters in friendly chat with bird or beast, and half believe it, the tale, true. Then we see in the closing 4 paragraphs about Alice's sister's dream, at the beginning of the 3rd paragraph, so she sat on with closed eyes and half believed herself in Wonderland. The word half, in both cases, occurring halfway through the relevant passages, encourages the reader to think in terms of halves. The symmetrical phrasing in the 2 passages, half believe, half believed, confirms the evident framing. The symmetry continues, including the story's beginning in chapter 1 with Alice and her sister on the riverbank, and closing there in chapter 12 as well. After the beginning, still in chapter 1, Alice wonders what a candle flame looks like after it's been blown out. Even as before the ending in chapter 9, she wonders what happens after the number of hours spent on lessons diminishes to nothing. The tail/tail of the mouse in chapter 3, visually underscored by the emblematic poem, is balanced by the head of the Cheshire Cat in chapter 8, visually underscored by the John Tenniel image. Furthermore, the caterpillar's returning to the beginning of the conversation in chapter 5 is echoed by the imagined return to the original seating at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in chapter 7. The anticipated halfway point of the 12th chapter, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, occurs at the end of chapter 6. To use an analogy appropriate to mathematician Charles Dodgson, we are bisecting a straight line. The critical central passage concerns Alice and the Cheshire Cat. And I quote, "All right," said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of the tail and ending with the grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat? It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. We have here two significant and characteristic patterns in the Alice books. First, the use of heads and tails, and second, the appearance of two words and their reappearance in reverse order. Carroll's employing the terms cat and grin, and his inversion of those terms to grin and cat is clearly chiastic. And even as the chiasmus suggests an X, the pattern ABBA also forms a circle. Carroll's particular reliance on this pattern and its relation to the heads and tails pattern will be clarified as we proceed. Our focus on the whole of Alice's adventures in Wonderland has led to the framing and then to the center. The pattern of heads and tails is evident throughout the book, not only in the mouse's tail and the Cheshire Cat's head, but also in Alice's chin striking her foot, and in her placing the lizard in the jury box, head downwards, as it was waving its tail about in a melancholy way. The pattern of chiasmus, itself involving a head, A, and a tail, B, is apparent early on in Alice, with Alice's questions. Do cats eat bats? Do bats eat cats? Later on, with Alice's trying to find her way out. And then adding, everything is so out of the way down here. And repeatedly, including the March Hare's cautioning Alice, you might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. Alice is noting that the girls were in the well, and the dormouse is responding, of course they were. Well in. And even the befuddled White King's murmuring, important, unimportant, unimportant, important. Again and again, head and tail, beginning and end, are united. Carroll repeatedly writes of Alice's wondering what happens at the end of a sequence, as in passages noted, when the candle flame goes out, when the ever-diminishing lessons end, and when everyone at the tea party has moved around to the end. These intimations of mortality suggest why, when the White King in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland advises the White Rabbit very gravely, only begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end, then stop, there was a dead silence in the court. The question is whether one stops or not. Carroll elaborates the same matter by repeatedly referring to both the Knoll set, no room, cry the March Hare, the Mad Hatter, and the Dormouse, and infinity. Alice in her book imagining that she should appear in the book, and the readers realizing that since Cheshire cheeses were once made in the shape of cats, the Cheshire Cat would eat the rat that would eat the cheese. And the concern with beginnings and ends may be seen as involving the process of composition as well. For literal language generates figurative language, and in the Alice books, that figurative language generates the literal. In Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Alice is literally falling asleep and literally growing up. Since it's tea time, the March Hare literally dips his watch in a cup of tea. The examples are abundant, and they are the source of much of the humor. Beginnings and ends continue to turn. What links the beginnings and ends, the heads and tails, in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? What is the key? I would argue that there is a specific visual clue, the whiting. Whitings, Alice tells the Mock Turtle, have their tails in their mouths, and the Mock Turtle and the Griffin agree. This is what seems to me to suggest the controlling image of Carroll's masterpiece, the mythical serpent with its tail in its mouth, the Ouroboros. That image represents the pattern we have noted, the repeated joining of beginning and end, the repeated union of head and tail. This image is nicely foreshadowed by the daisy chain that Alice considers making, a bracelet or necklace of daisies in which the flower of one daisy is fastened to the stem of the neck, next, head to tail. And we find the resonant image of the Ouroboros again in Through the Looking Glass, a book whose 150th anniversary we are celebrating. The two Alice books match. In this connection, it is telling that some years later, Carroll was concerned that the frontispiece of Sylvie and Bruno concluded and that of Sylvie and Bruno match. Indeed, he acknowledged to his illustrator, Harry Furness, "I have a passion for symmetry." We may initially observe the framing in Through the Looking Glass. Here again, we may proceed from the outside in. The opening poem addressed to Alice is paralleled by the closing poem that acrostically honors Alice. The subsequent cluster of details in chapter 1, including Dinah's washing the white kitten, the black kitten's chasing its own tail, and Alice's placing the red queen in front of the black kitten, corresponds to the cluster of details in chapters 9 to 12, including the red queen's running after her shawl, Alice's placing the black kitten and the red queen facing one another, and Dinah's washing the white kitten. Alice is later responding to the White Queen's acceptance of a run that yields no progress in chapter 2. "Well, in our country, you generally get to somewhere else," relates to Alice's responding to the White Queen's mention of a group of Tuesdays together in chapter 11. "In our country, there's only one day at a time." The absence of names in chapter 3 is balanced by the abundance of names in chapter 8, as is the Battle of Tweedledum and Tweedledee in chapter 4, with the Battle of the Red Knight and the White Knight in chapter 8. The White Queen's running in chapter 5 recurs in chapter 7, even as the Mad Hatter, who is in prison in chapter 5, is only just out of prison in chapter 7. Again, the halfway point in Carroll's 12-chapter book occurs at the end of chapter 6. We may recall the analogy of bisecting a straight line. The vital passage concerns the fall of the proud Humpty Dumpty, a passage that makes literal the familiar caution drawn from Proverbs 16:18, that pride goeth before a fall. At this moment, a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. This crash, at the center of Through the Looking Glass, has the pride of place, a place that reveals the result of pride. The phrase end to end is also suggestive, and we do have a vital parallel with the disappearing Cheshire Cat at the center of Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Ostensibly, perhaps, we have another puzzling riddle, like why is a raven like a writing desk? Something like, why is a feline like an egg? Yet an essential similarity may emerge on reconsideration. The first central passage concerns a cat's vanishing from tail to grin, and the second central passage concerns the death of an egg. The underlying pattern of both passages is the union of the end and the beginning, the Ouroboros. Whether the mythical creature is suggested spatially, tail to grin, or temporally, death of an egg, it is still the same creature. And so we may answer both Alice's question, "Tell me, Dinah, did you turn to Humpty Dumpty?" and Gardner's question, "Why did Alice think Humpty was Dinah?" The Ouroboros passage at the center of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, concerning the Cheshire Cat, the Wonderland version of Dinah, turned to the Ouroboros passage at the center of Through the Looking Glass, concerning Humpty Dumpty. Indeed, DH did become HD. The centers of the two books are as dense as the stories themselves seem light and airy. The pattern of heads and tails in Through the Looking Glass is suggested not only by Humpty Dumpty, the egg soon to die, but also by Alice's asking the White Knight, "How can you go on talking so quietly, head downwards," as she dragged him out by the feet. And in that second book, instances of chiasmus continued to appear, from Humpty Dumpty's reciting first, "But he was very stiff and proud," and then, "and he was very proud and stiff," to the White Knight's declaring of his mousetrap, "I suppose the mice keep the bees out, or the bees keep the mice out," to Alice's saying of the Red King, "He was part of my dream, of course, but then I was part of his dream too." Head and tail, beginning and end, continue to be united. And attention to the end of a sequence continues. The bread and butterfly will die because it can never find its only food, weak tea with cream in it. And then there is still the null set, to be able to see nobody, and at that distance too, marvels the White King. And infinity, Alice is dreaming of dreaming. Figurative language generates literal language in Through the Looking Glass too. Most flowers are asleep because their beds are too soft. A butterfly becomes an actual bread and butterfly, and the frog, with a frog in his throat, gets in the spirit of the Looking Glass world, replying, "To answer the door, what's it been asking of?" Beginnings and ends are still circling around. How is the Ouroboros intimated in Through the Looking Glass beyond the fall of Humpty Dumpty? There are two clues, the black kitten and the red queen. As aforementioned, the black kitten was running after its own tail, just as the red queen was later running round and round after her own shawl. Later, Alice says that the black kitten must have been the red queen. The two images suggest, like the whiting, tail and mouth in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the daisy chain, stem to flower, the serpent with its tail in its mouth, end to end, the Ouroboros. This mythic figure has occasionally been mentioned in criticism on Alice. Kenneth Burke links the unending mad tea party to the Ouroboros, which he suggests is emblematic of the digestive tract. Margaret Bow Burns offers a chiastic solution to the Mad Hatter's riddle. A raven eats worms, a writing desk is worm eaten. Citing Eric Newman's The Origins of the History of Consciousness and its discussion of the maternal Ouroboros, and concluding that the laws of the alimentary canal reign supreme. Anna Kershey proposes that the blending of reality and fiction in the Alice books recalls the mythical Ouroboros snake biting its own tail. But Amy Mandelker comes closer than the others to clarifying the essential pattern. She writes, "The question of where something ends or begins suggests the figure of the Ouroboros, which appears in Alice as the whiting, a fish with its tail in its mouth." She goes on to link the fish to the death and resurrection of Christ. And given that, as already noted, the Cheshire Cat as cheese may be said to eat the rat that eats the cheese, she asserts that the Cheshire Cat is a metaphor for the snake that eats itself. Mandelker's insights are strong, but they could go farther. My own view, as indicated, is that the Ouroboros is the single image permeating the two Alice books, holding each of them together, uniting the two, and serving as the center of both. The literature on the Ouroboros is substantial. The image goes back to Egypt, and the traditional interpretation of the snake with its tail in its mouth is as an emblem of eternity. Carroll's abiding concern in the Alice books is death. As he writes in the prefatory poem to Through the Looking Glass, "We are but older children, dear, who fret to find our bedtime near." However, bedtime may yield to awakening. I would argue that the Alice books are Carroll's covert meditation on death and the afterlife, with the Ouroboros image conveying his hope, expressed in the words of the whiting in the lobster quadrille. "What matters it, how far we go?" his scaly friend replied. "There is another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance." We may find the man behind the Ouroboros in the 1876 An Easter Greeting to Every Child Who Loves Alice, wherein Carroll writes to his child readers explicitly of a brighter dawn than this, a new and glorious day. For the day that celebrates the resurrection of Christ, Carroll speaks of the rebirth of all. And the man behind the Ouroboros appears occasionally in his personal writing. For instance, Charles Dodgson wrote in his journal of November 30th, 1881, concerning the end of his career as a lecturer, "There is a sadness in coming to the end of anything in life. Man's instincts cling to the life that will never end." And he wrote in a letter to Mrs. C.H.M. Milam of September 5th, 1884, "I think we treat death far too much as the end of all things." The beliefs of Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson, were Christian, of course, but his faith may be recognized in many religions. The hermeneutic circle then yields an Ouroboros circle, a circle of unending rebirth at the centers of the Alice books. To return to the beginning then, I think I'm right. And yes, you can mention it to your friends. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
So good. Good job.
So if we can, I'm assuming Byron is still, there's Byron, I see him up there. If we can get the spotlight back on Byron, thank you very much. I want to, so folks feel free to put your questions in the chat or send them to me through a direct message in the chat also. I want to start by, I was trying to manage the time efficiently, and Richard, I apologize for not giving you your introduction. So I'm glad that you showed your book anyway. So I'm glad that we did that. I wanted to start by asking if you talk a little more about the idea of the sort of literal becoming the figurative, becoming the literal that you talked about earlier.
Well, the first part, Lewis Carroll didn't have to work on. We have figurative language. We make figurative language out of the literal. What Lewis Carroll did is he did the second part. He took the figurative language and he turned it into the literal. So, falling asleep, that's a figurative expression for the literal act of going to sleep. And that already existed. Lewis Carroll took the figurative expression, falling asleep, and he literalized it, making the sleeping Alice fall. And he does that over and over again. So insofar as the literal creates the figurative in the world, and the figurative creates the literal in Lewis Carroll, we have a circle, which echoes the other circles.
And you mentioned a bit about sort of the density of the structure and the centers and the contrast with kind of the airiness of the tone. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit and how how those contrasts play out through the books.
Well, even in the popular culture, if you say going down the rabbit hole, you mean going into something chaotic and wild, which is part of the charm of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. It does seem chaotic and wild. But I would argue, I have argued, that wildness is undergirded by an order that Lewis Carroll has in mind, involving the structure of the book and the central image of the Ouroboros. So we have the best of both worlds. We have sort of a frothy, fanciful, wild series of adventures, and we also have a very well worked out artistic order at the same time.
Thank you. And speaking of wildness, Byron, I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on, you mentioned the collaboration with the biologist, I believe, and sort of emerging from your illustrations of the scorpion. And I wonder if you sort of elaborate a bit more on that project and how that all came about.
Sure. When I was first in England, under Lewis Carroll Academy, I met John Davis. And soon after that, a couple of years later, John found out that I was going to live in Australia for a year. And I said, and he asked me, he wrote me and I said, would you please find me a Australian Alice, because I don't have one in my collection. And I said, sure, I'll look. And I spent a lot of time looking and I couldn't find any. Turns out there are some old ones, but at the time I couldn't find them. I was down in the southern part of Australia. So I said, well, I can't buy you one, so I'll make you one. So I took it on myself to do all of the illustrations that appear in Alicia in the Dreamtime, and took them hand in hand to a book dealer, a book publisher. And they liked the drawings, but they didn't liked the idea of having the text in English, so they arranged for having the book translated bilingually to use as a textbook for teaching teachers who would go into the outback to a certain group of Australian Aboriginals. So I eventually finally had a book published in Australia for John Davis, and that was my main thrust.
There was also a question for you in the chat about aside from the parodies of Carroll, what are the other parodies that you admire or inspire your work?
Alice is easy to parody. Looking Glass isn't so easy. Snark is very easy to parody, and then it's been parodied I don't know how many times. I've even on occasion parodied Sylvie and Bruno, and August also has a fondness for parodying. So we sort of back and forth with each other parody. Here's an interesting one. Let's think about this, that kind of thing. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and then we threw it away like we did. He had one very funny idea of a parody where the main character is the overstuffed chair that Dodson kept in his photography room, where so many people sat on the same couch. And it would be wonderful if the couch could have a mechanism in it to keep a record of all the wonderful conversations that would have happened on that couch. So he and I have sort of the same sort of craziness, I suppose. But I really do enjoy sci-fi. I enjoy murder mysteries. I really enjoy all those kinds of action kind of things. And so wherever I've lived all over the world, that I have never left that place without having been at least one parody. And it's just a theme in my life. Is I love Lewis Carroll and his original stories, and I love to parody them. It's just a lot of fun.
That's a fun approach to travel, is to leave no place unparodied.
That's right. A lot of that.
Someone asked in the chat, why is Looking Glass harder to parody than Wonderland?
No, I don't really know. It's just, it seems like Looking Glass is a much more constructed thing. It's hard to do. At least for me, I can't parody the dialogue as well. I've tried a few times, but it's always been a disappointment to me. Sometimes you can word it into a murder mystery or something like that, but as far as a straight parody, it's just, for me, it's difficult. Snark, you'd think would be a little bit harder, but it's actually easier. My brother and I both are Lewis Carroll people, and we have done, for the fun of it, we've done several parodies where we just changed the characters from the ones listed in the list. We did one, for example, all the people on the boat in the Snark are goats, and another one, all the characters in the story are other animals. You can just plug things in and then change the story a little bit, and it takes on a whole new meaning. It's like sort of like Lewis Carroll left us this wonderful platform, and here's a series of men and animals, and if you try a little bit, you can twist them around and enjoy creating something that's still recognizable as a Snark, but had never been done before. And so it's a wonderful gift he gave to us. He probably would hate it. I would say one thing. When I was in England, and I showed them my book the first time I met them, it was real obvious, real fast, that they did not like parody. So it sort of limited what I could do and kind of send to England. They just didn't like it. But I think some of them finally softened up a little bit, but they were more structured. They didn't want you parodying stuff. I'm protecting it.
Thank
But
you.
you can't protect that stuff.
Right. Thank you. Richard, there's a question. Are there other examples of Carroll's idea of an afterlife or pointers to how he may have conceived of that?
Well, I brought up the ones I knew. Perhaps there are others, but I found both the Easter greetings and the personal letters examples that I cited to be suggestive of a faith that he had. Nobody knows. Lewis Carroll didn't know, but this was his faith. And if there are other instances, I'd be glad to know about them, but those are the ones that I found.
And this is a bit of a longer question, so I'm going to read it to make sure that I get it. And this is also for Richard. Given how to read the whiting as the central image of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, what do you make of the conversation between the Mock Turtle and Alice when the Mock Turtle asks Alice if she has seen them? And she replies, yes, I've often seen them at dinner. And she checked herself hastily.
She doesn't want to get into the fact that she ate I believe that's it, that she ate the whiting. She's always having trouble with her natural prejudices, for instance, against mice and rats, and catching herself and not saying the thing that would offend the person she's speaking to. And I think that's the case there, where she stops at din and doesn't say dinner because she ate the whiting. Right. I think that's the explanation.
And to come back to the beginning of your talk, what was do you know the reason or the rationale behind recommending of human bondage to you in the first place?
Well, this was, say, 1966, and my guess is that the teacher thought that this was a profound book about the meaning of life that a 16-year-old could handle. And you know, it wasn't part of the curriculum, but he thought maybe I could handle it. I mean, that's my guess. It was a fellow named Francis Schrag, who's still alive, teaching at the University of Wisconsin. If he remembers why he suggested it, then I'd be happy to know. But that was my inference.
All right, and then Byron, folks are asking, since we didn't get to see your illustrations today, and you mentioned sort of the corpus of Sueliana, where might folks, what do you recommend for folks to sort of maybe online or elsewhere to get a glimpse or an introduction to your illustration?
The best way is to go online and just type in my name and say Byron Sewell books or Byron Sewell illustrations or Byron Sewell this or that, and you'll see a long list of things. A lot of them have been published by Evertype. They're very inexpensive little books. And also my brother and I have recently been doing some of that publishing ourselves. So there's quite a number of things that you can see. Some of them are simply my illustrations for somebody else's books. Sometimes I've written and illustrated. Sometimes, and usually anymore, my brother is very clever with dust jackets. So and well, not dust jackets, but the covers, the cheap covers. He's very good at that. So you can find most of those books that we wrote or illustrated available on Amazon. They're usually $15 or something like that. There's other ones, but those are mostly the things that are now. I didn't have that opportunity on my first collection because it was very difficult to publish books back in the 70s or 80s unless you were famous. But with self-publishing, you can create a lot of this stuff, and it costs very little.
Patty and Tyson, we have a question from Mark Richards, whether he can show the 16-foot snark illustration. He has it on hand. Should we try to do that now, or is that better for the lunch hour?
We can do it. What?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes, so we can.
Should we spotlight Mark?
Yeah.
Okay, let me try this. I don't know if it'll work, but So here's the book. Well, look, here's the book. And it opens out like this. And it opens out like this. Is this working? I'm not sure. You get an idea, I think.
Yeah, we're getting a
Yeah.
good image.
I think something's wrong because it can't possibly be this long.
It's not like joining up at the beginning again like an Ouroboros or anything. No, it's this one long linear thing.
When I
And
see
there,
this,
so
oh, sorry.
it's fantastic if you can actually pull the whole thing out. It looks good. I hope I've given you an impression of what it's like. If I can get it back, I don't know.
Yes, thank you.
Anyway, there we are. It's a beautifully produced book, and that's I think that gives you an impression. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for showing that. I'm glad folks were able to see, and thanks for folks for asking the question. So as we approach our lunch hour, I want to ask one more question of Richard, and that is, again, going back to your talk, why, what drew you into sort of becoming a word reverser in the first place, as you described that?
Well, I had a babysitter who, who told me my name backwards was Dracha Yelpak, and I was fascinated and started seeing things that way and words that way, and reversing words on cereal boxes. And I see this stop sign and it says pots, and it's just a habit that I couldn't get the better of. And I think that it must have been a habit for Lewis Carroll too. So occasionally I could go backwards with him. By the way, it's true of Poe as well.
I wish that we all had such babysitters that had such formative experiences that made such awesome literary careers. I wish we all had that experience. Well, thank you all very much for those. Those were really delightful and informative, and really appreciate your preparation and time and all you shared with us.